So introducing these two individuals quickly here before I pass it off to Laurie to talk about Kloppenberg. The beginning thing to say is he was in the Peace Corps in Botswana, where he saw, the way they practice agriculture and everything else. And that led him to think about studying agriculture as an academic. And he got into a PhD program in rural sociology at Cornell, which is the top program in, I don't know, probably the world for that kind of a degree. He's now an emeritus professor at UW-Madison, but he's done a ton of broader work on food sheds, local food economy, and agroecology. He also has strong ties to the community and is actively involved in a number of organizations. Here he is with a seed saver group in Maine. And you can see, this is just a great picture of him holding up the jar of indentured seed and free seed, characterizes it pretty well. And he's also an avid gardener. He opens the book with, his preface to the book opens with him talking about being in his garden and planting all of these seeds that have been developed through biotechnological advances. And then we have Mackenzie Wark. In many ways, a public intellectual, gives lectures all over. Part of the public intellectual bit has to do with her association with the New School in New York, which is a place, it's kind of a hub of more public-facing intellectuals in the United States. She got her PhD in communications in Australia, and she's published a ton of different theoretical works on digital economy, media, and technology. Most notably, Hacker Manifesto, which is what we're reading, Gamer Theory, and then fairly recently, I think 2019 or 2020, I can't remember, is Capital is Dead, Is This Something Worse? Which in many ways is an update and continuation of the theses and ideas that come about in Hacker Manifesto.
Kloppenberg's book is called First the Seed, the Political Economy of Plant Biotechnology. It was updated in 2004. The original was published in 1988. And I wanted to highlight this term political economy. Political economy is a term that political scientists use, but it might not be something that's terribly familiar. I, in that slide, say liberal dissociation, because I'm sort of at the point where I think that one of the problems with liberalism is that it makes everything a discrete entity and problem, and it doesn't encourage you to put to link the dots together. It separates gains in technical efficiency and profits from their social and political ramifications. But the study of political economy does not do that. It in fact does the opposite. It tries to study the impact on social, cultural, and political things of these technical innovations and economic change. So technical and economic advances are not separate, and I would argue are not morally neutral and cannot be separated from their impacts. Here you have some news anchors there from the left and the right. Both left and right-wing news anchors are notorious for casting moral blame on individuals and groups for their ignorance or just plain evil character. It's just so easy and it gets people riled up, but in no way does it point in the direction of the cause of social and political disturbances, from rising violent crime, mass killings, rampant divorce and family breakdown, racial prejudice and violence, anti-racist violence, and political radicalism and unrest, such as produced the Capitol riot and fuels the membership of the Proud Boys. So Kloppenberg is bringing political economy to the study of the privatization of seeds and their genetic information. For instance, early on in the preface to his book, we see this observation that our population of agricultural plants is as immigrant in character as the nation's human population. None of the crops that today make the United States an agricultural power is indigenous to North America. Had new crop plants not been introduced from other regions of the world, there would not have been a plant genetic base sufficient to provide an agriculture capable of sustaining the tide of human immigration. This observation invites us to contemplate the extractive quality of our use of seed acquisition to populate the US with European immigrants. It's easy to see that the importation of slave labor helped build the country, but it's not as easy to see how the accumulation of genetic information locked in seeds fueled the growth of the country, later to be used to create patented products to be sold back to the countries they originally came from, along with the machinery and chemical products needed to successfully use them. You can see how there are moral implications that arise from that story. Go ahead. So Kloppenberg tells us this history of seed acquisition. Part of this is just, it's a history, and it's a very useful history. And it starts with a discussion of this power struggle between, say, public and private goals and interests. And he says that there are two obstacles to the development of private plant breeding for profit. One was the very reproducibility of seed, which made the farmer, the commercial seed company's prime competitor. Think about that the farmer could produce his own seed, so he didn't really need companies to do it. And in a way, the companies would have seen that as competition and would have tried to figure out how to kind of get around that obstacle. And then early on, the state also was an institutional obstacle to the expansion of a commercial seed industry. We'll talk a lot more about that, but the state initially saw its role as gathering a lot of information, doing research, and disseminating information and seed and other materials to farmers with the goal of more or less, sort of just feeding people, making sure that US farming was as strong as it could be. But then he turns to the private industry trying to find a way to profit from this business and fighting back in a way in competition with farmers as well as the state. With the use of science to make seed more amenable to commodification, such as hybridization. Hybridized seeds cannot really be saved and reused because they will grow a plant, but the plant will not be true to the hybrid. And if you become accustomed to that hybrid, or that hybrid is better suited, and now you're in competition with others that are using similar things, you don't want to go back. So that means you have to buy it again every year rather than save your seed. Also, private industry fought back by promoting the passage of laws to protect plant germplasm as private property, like the passage of the Plant Variety Protection Act. And patent law in general became more and more applied to biological material. And Kloppenberg also then talks about how the state and its wing, the universities as sort of a wing of the state, turn towards helping these private interests. And so changed its mission at a certain point. So as the private or corporate seed trade grew stronger through hybridization and other means, public land grant universities were more limited to activities complementary to rather than competitive with those of private capital, meaning that the interest shifted from, the interest in making sure that the country was strong and well fed to associating private business profit with the country being strong and well fed, if that makes sense. Public universities as a wing of government now subsidize the process of commodification of seed and all phases of food production by offsetting the cost of research, development, and of farming itself. The entire industry is heavily subsidized, and that's something that people don't necessarily know. And that's a picture of Fruit Loops, because way more money is made off of silly things like Fruit Loops. It's about 2 cents worth of whatever they're made of, probably corn or maybe rice, I'm not sure, and food coloring and a whole lot of sugar, a whole lot of sugar and marketing. So Kloppenberg defines biotechnology like this. He says it's any technique that uses living organisms or parts of organisms to make or modify products, to improve plants or animals, or to develop microorganisms for specific uses. Though the term has only recently been added to our lexicon, it encompasses human activities of considerable antiquity. The fermentation of beer, the making of cheese, and the baking of bread can all be considered biotechnological processes given the use they make of yeasts. So biotechnology is nothing new. Engineering nature has been around since ancient times. Even Plato mentions it. Now we have reached the stage of non-sexual reproduction, though, through various technical methods, which Kloppenberg thinks is a level up with far-reaching ramifications, especially when combined with patents to protect the genetic information from the created seeds. So, to get to the heart of the matter, why political economy and why my particular interest as a political scientist, people and how people react to these things. If we take a step back and we think about the fact that for most of human history, most of the world has either lived off the land or has farmed, right? And you realize what has happened as the way that we produce food has changed. A once very large class of people who were once relatively independent, or at least had the hope of being on any given year, because they could reproduce the means of their own subsistence, their own lives, are now utterly dependent upon the purchase of inputs and a globalized commodity market. This massive shift creates huge demographic, cultural, and political disturbances, both in the United States and around the world. From the United States to India and everywhere around the globe, the ripple effects of this huge shift in ownership caused by the, as Wark puts it, vectoralist class has created nationalist, populist, right-wing and left-wing radicalization and social and cultural unrest. You can't displace and marginalize this many people and not expect them to get angry. So some of the social and political impacts that we're seeing are growing regional inequalities, both around the world as well as in our own country, income and power inequalities between rural and urban places, displacement of workers and displacement of populations, including the dying off of many communities, depressed farm commodity prices, rising land and equipment prices, increasing input prices, commercial input dependency and loss of freedom for the farmers, agrochemical dependence, and environmental harm. Now, not all of these are related specifically to this seed hacking that Kloppenberg wants to talk about, but they are related to all of the changes, including that have taken place in farming that Jacob was referring to when he showed you that chart, which is how, the industries, the large industries have come to take such a controlling share of the market and the inputs that are now necessary for modern agriculture. So in the United States, and this is something we looked at in our research, Jacob and I's research, we see, for instance, decreased personal and family self-sufficiency, psychological harm from dislocating and disembedding, changes in ways of life, and having to move, political polarization and radicalization like the right-wing populism that we're seeing now in the United States. Rural poverty and food deserts, drug and alcohol abuse, increased suicide rates in rural areas, and an increased urban poor via the slow mass migration that's taken place over the decades as fewer and fewer people can find work in the country. And on the global scale, you see a lot of the same things, but in addition to the same sort of sickness of a social nature that takes place, we also have this international dynamic of North-South interdependence, economic interdependence, which we're finding out is not really all that great, during times of hardship when supply chain issues and worker shortage and all sorts of things can massively interfere with your supply of basic needs and can really hurt your economy. We used to think as political scientists that interdependence was nothing but good. It would be peace and prosperity to all, and that just hasn't worked. And then in addition to that, we have the Southern dependency upon this type of agriculture, something that we'll get to more later, but you see there a picture of somebody from India who's a part of Hindu nationalism, which is attributable to these kinds of changes. So in my mind, as a political scientist, I see a direct connection between right-wing radicalism in the United States and in India and elsewhere in the world. And this is one of the core fundamental instigators of it because it causes huge demographic, cultural, and economic shifts that human beings have a hard time handling. How has plant breeding been slowly commodified? Kloppenberg tells us a tale that, again, we'll get to more as time goes by. But there are three factors that I just want to highlight tonight. The first one is scientific mystification. It is in our minds, our myth of the hacker heroes, the scientists in the lab. Kloppenberg does a great job of describing this sort of mythos in our head. He says, the secrets of nature are thought to be uncovered serially and in an orderly fashion by a series of savants, of brilliant people, each of whom begets his or her successor in a sequence of almost biblical linearity. But actually, science always takes place in the broader social context in which economic and political interests are at play. And Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions was a classic in showing these political, social dynamics in science. Our scientific hackers in both university and commercial settings are lionized as disinterested, creative individuals who are just on some random adventure of discovery. But this is a mythos that has its roots in the religious embrace of Enlightenment faith. It does not comport with reality, in which scientists are human beings with a need for a paycheck and with desire for prestige. Their research isn't random, and it has become more and more guided by corporate funding as state funding has declined. So a second point that he wants to make as far as causation is changing government priorities. Again, I won't belabor this because I've already mentioned it, but the early priorities were sort of preservative and growth oriented and involved a lot of sharing. And that's how the land grant college kind of got started, with this, this sort of philosophy that was more about national strength and economic growth than it was particular technologies or industries. Okay. And then, go ahead, government changed its priorities and it became more interested in expanding and locking in markets as the United States became a global power. Okay. So then it got tied up with global power, the reach of the United States in all sorts of ways around the globe, including our economic power. So we promoted yield increasing technologies at home and abroad, which came to be known as the Green Revolution. That's Norman Borlaug there, one of the chief authors of the Green Revolution, who created a type of wheat that was more easily harvested because it was shorter and it had a higher yield. And he shared that technology with people in the developing world. The initial idea was to feed the world and to basically share what was needed for people to stop starving, which is a very laudable goal. But when political interests and private corporate interests are in the mix of that, then that motivation can kind of turn, or be turned, I should say. So there became support for the private and corporate commodification of agricultural genetic information via patent law from the government, public subsidization of basic scientific and economic research that aids continued market capture at all levels of food production. And Kloppenberg says, born of the passionate marriage of academia and venture capital, genetic engineering firms are devoted to the commodification of research and process itself. And that's particularly attractive to university folks now in the wake of the gradual withdrawal of financial support for public universities by state houses across this country. And final factor is international power politics, which I've already alluded to. But you can see the real interest in the United States, a very powerful country, really an imperial power, which will, of course, want to project its own system and dominance towards other countries. So it was natural for the United States to conceive of capitalism as good for everybody, and for the technologies that we produce to be good for everybody as well. And for this idea of more or less economic growth and interdependence will fix all problems mentality to emerge. Earl Butz, of course, is famous. He's the Secretary of Agriculture during the Nixon administration, who first said what already was the case and has been for centuries and centuries: food is a weapon. But the international markets and the control of technology have made that weapon very much more powerful and lethal than it used to be. Okay, I'm getting towards the end because I want to give Jacob some time. So Kloppenberg's normative goal is, as he puts it, to support the continuing struggle to achieve a sustainable agriculture responsive to human needs. And I would say that that goes along with Mackenzie Wark's notion that hackers need to be freed to do their magic in support of human needs, that it really is something that could be used in a very positive way if it was aimed correctly towards those needs.